Allegations that South Africa supplied arms to Russia in a time of war and sanctions are continuing to make headlines. The allegations were made by the United States. Here to give us some perspective is global arms trade expert Andrew Feinstein. Andrew, welcome.
Thanks, good to be with you.
Please remind our viewers how you first became involved in the investigation of corrupt and illicit arms deals.
So I was the ranking ANC member of Parliament's Public Accounts Committee when we received a report from the Auditor General about our big arms deal and prima facie evidence of huge corruption in the deal. So the committee took to investigating it. As we proceeded with the investigation, my own party got less than enthusiastic about the investigation and suggested to me that we should deal with this matter privately within the party rather than publicly in Parliament. And I knew what that meant, having had some experience of private investigations within the party, which meant nothing was investigated. So I kept on pushing and was eventually forced out of Parliament. I resigned the night before the ANC were going to replace me on the parliamentary list. And since then, I've really dedicated myself to investigating the global trade in weapons. Because at first I thought, none of us expected to be in government. We've just been taken for a ride by these international arms companies. But then I discovered that what happened to us happens all over the world, all the time. That the trade in weapons accounts for around 40% of all corruption in world trade. So it's a hugely corrupt industry, and the corruption's built into the economics of the trade. So I've written a couple of books about it, a book that some people might remember called After the Party, a personal and political journey in the ANC, and then a book called The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade, Indefensible, the 7 Myths that Sustain the Global Arms Trade, and various others. And a film was made of the Shadow World book that we showed in South Africa a few years ago when it first came out. So I now have a very small organization based in London called Shadow World Investigations, and we investigate the global arms trade and state capture because the two are very closely related on a global basis and on an ongoing basis.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, let's go to the allegations that South Africa supplied Russia with arms and ammunition. What do you make of that allegation?
The first thing to bear in mind when looking at these sorts of things, and I'm not saying this makes it true or false, but the first victim in any war, even before the human victims, is truth. I mean, war gives rise to the ultimate propaganda. And every side involved in a war, either directly or indirectly, is probably going to be spreading some form of untruth about what is going on. So that has to be our starting point. So I think we've got to be cynical and we've got to be skeptical. So let's remind ourselves, and the South African-based group Open Secrets has done some brilliant work on this, on South Africa's arms trading throughout the years, both before 94 and after. They produced a very recent brilliant report on South African arms being used in the Rwandan genocide, for instance. They've also done huge amounts of work on South African arms, mainly from Germany, coming through South Africa through a company called Rheinmetall Denel Munitions, and finding their way to Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and being used in the Yemen conflict, where tens of thousands of civilians are being killed, and not as collateral damage, but actually intentionally targeted. And we have a problem in South Africa with the control of our arms exports. So you may recall that many years ago, there was something called the Cameron Commission, and it sort of highlighted a whole lot of malfeasance in arms transactions through South Africa, which resulted in a conventional arms control act. So this act created a committee comprised of ministers, which is supposed to approve any exports of weapons through or from South Africa. Now, the committee has said that there are no licenses for exports to Russia. So that means either there weren't exports, or, which is probably likely because this committee tends to say yes to any export request it gets. Or if there has been an export, it's illegal in terms of South African law because there has been no export license issued for it. My immediate instinct is, are there lots of arms and ammunitions manufactured in South Africa that Russia would want for the Ukraine conflict? And the response to that is probably not, which doesn't mean that arms might not have been coming through South Africa. So we might have been acting as some sort of gateway or conduit for arms that Russia might want from other countries. But South Africa was perceived as a sort of an inconspicuous way of getting them to Russia. That's always possible. But we don't know at the moment, to be quite honest, whether in fact there have been arms exported. The one thing that I do wonder, though, is for the Americans to respond in the manner that they did means one of two things for me. Because it was really, diplomacy isn't normally carried on like this, where you sort of what would be called megaphone diplomacy. You basically shout at a country that it's doing something you don't like. And when America does that, the shout tends to be very loud. So either they do have evidence that arms and ammunition have at least come through South Africa on their way to Russia after Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. So it would be an illegal export. Or this could be the Americans really warning South Africa about our neutrality in the Russia-Ukraine conflict and suggesting that we really shouldn't be cozying up to Russia, which would be their interpretation of the relationship. So it could well be one of those two things. So it's very difficult to say whether actual physical arms and ammunition have landed up going to the Russians from South Africa.
There are a couple of narratives out there, alternative narratives. I'm sure you've heard them all. One being that arms were in fact imported from Russia for our troops in Mozambique, who are apparently short of weaponry. And that it was the fulfillment of an order placed well before the war.
Yeah.
Have you heard that narrative?
That is quite possible, because obviously sometimes these things do take time. However, again, one would expect, because before Russia invaded Ukraine, there wouldn't really have been any major issue with South Africa exporting to Russia. Look, some Western countries, the United Kingdom, the United States, all of whom have themselves exported weapons to Russia over time. I mean, the United Kingdom in particular, they only really started pulling back on their exports 2017, 2019. And that's when initially there was a sort of an informal embargo, if you will, on arms exports to Russia. And the reality is that, a power, a superpower like the United States of America, if it tells people not to export weapons to a certain country, it expects to be obeyed, because America has for so long seen itself as the world's policeman, which is a whole conversation on its own. But it is possible that there was an export due, but then the question has to be asked, why was no export license granted by the Conventional Arms Control Committee? Because it would have been very easy then for the government to say, well, here's the export license that was granted. It just took a few years for the actual delivery to take place. And they'd be able to respond to the Americans in that way, but they haven't done that. And, if there was an export, the reasons for that might be that, maybe an export license wasn't issued, which does sometimes happen, or the export license had untruths on it, which also happens. So in other words, it was said it was going somewhere else, but it was actually intended for Russia. And the reason for that might be if there was, significant amounts of corruption in a deal, and the authorities didn't want it to become public knowledge.
Okay, so we don't know, but should it be proven, what do you believe the consequences will be for South Africa?
Well, I think the consequences would be obviously a sort of chilling of relations with the United States of America. the US is a very important trade partner for South Africa. We have certain treaties in place that enable us to trade fairly easily with the US. Those would probably be revoked. So trade with the United States could become more difficult. It would be a sort of a firm statement of where we stand geopolitically, because I think since 1994, really, we haven't done the West's bidding, if you will. You'll remember that extraordinary Nelson Mandela interview. I think it might even have been before he became president, after he'd been released from prison, where he was interviewed on a US news channel. And they were basically asking him about, his links to Gaddafi in Libya and various other places. And, in his usual extraordinarily quiet but incredibly devastating way, he said, we are not going to abandon our friends who helped us in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. So I think from that moment, it's been very clear that we are not just going to fall in line behind Western governments. And especially in the last few months, we've seen a sort of a ramping up of a third bloc, if you will, a bloc of what historically used to be called non-aligned countries, really. And various alternatives emerging of China in particular and a number of other countries, effectively forming both an economic and a political bloc that the United States would not be particularly happy with. So I think this could be a hastening of that sort of change in the relationship with the US and the West. Would they take other punitive action? I'd be surprised. They're not, I'm not exactly sure what they could do. They could probably try and ban South African arms exports to anywhere in the world. But our industry is such a mess anyway. That would just be the final nail in the coffin of South Africa's defense industry and defense exports, which in my opinion wouldn't be a terrible thing anyway.
So the US is obviously not seeing South Africa's neutrality on the war between Russia and the Ukraine as particularly neutral.
Exactly. I think there is a sense that the relationship with Russia is closer than one of neutrality. But I'm not aware, and I haven't followed it that closely, but I'm not aware of South Africa condoning Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine and the quite appalling consequences there have been for Ukrainian civilians. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, we should also be balanced in these things. I don't believe, Putin's action was illegal. There is no doubt about that in terms of any form of international law. Yes, there were certain provocations. The West promised Russia, as the Soviet Union disappeared, the West repeatedly promised Russia that NATO would not move eastwards, and it has moved eastwards at great pace. And really, Ukraine is probably the final domino in that movement of NATO ever eastwards, and would have, a Ukraine in NATO would mean you could have American missiles on the border of Russia. So you can understand why any country would be a bit upset by that. You can also understand why a sort of a strongman leader like Vladimir Putin, of whom I am no admirer, would want to react to that. I think the war isn't going. Yeah, well, absolutely. I think the war hasn't gone well for Russia. I think at the same time, I have great sympathy for Ukrainian civilians and Russian peace activists who are both sort of caught in the middle of this. But Ukraine is hardly a sort of a paragon of virtue itself, and this coming back to the arms and ammunition. Before the invasion, Ukraine was widely seen by people who work on the global arms trade as a very, very problematic country when it came to arms. That often it would import weapons that would then be diverted to all sorts of countries that shouldn't be receiving those weapons. Its defense sector is notoriously and deeply corrupt. It even stands out within the very corrupt global arms trade. The President Zelensky, who some people would say in slightly cynical terms has had a good war. It shouldn't be forgotten that in the release of the Pandora Papers, he was found to have a lot of money offshore, in an offshore jurisdiction that the Pandora Papers came from. He has also, weirdly, because he is Jewish, he has also allowed a sort of an adoration of really neo-fascist figures from Ukraine's history. During his presidency, a lot of streets have been named after these neo-fascist leaders from the country's history. There are neo-Nazi militias that have been incorporated into the military. So, of course, when a country gets attacked, the media starts dispensing this image of this perfect country that is all good. And as I said, the first victim in a war is truth. So the situation is more complex. But the bottom line is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was an illegal act of aggression. And therefore, I don't believe any country, including South Africa, should be providing weapons to Russia at the moment.
If we go back to the war possibly having been provoked by the US, do you think that could have been part of a bait and bleed strategy? That because they knew how Putin would react?
Yeah, I definitely think in part, if you look at some of the rhetoric that has emerged, not just from the US, but from Western European governments as well, and the UK. I mean, a defense minister in the UK says, the UK is at war with Russia. So all those people calling the war sort of a proxy war, of course, jumped on that because that's exactly what it suggests. And there are all sorts of crazy politicians in the US who've basically said that the US should be actively participating in the war and that they should basically go all the way to Moscow. And, initially President Biden very ill-advisedly said that Putin needs to go. And why I say ill-advisedly, because it's also illegal for any other country to talk about overthrowing another government, even though the US is probably the greatest practitioner of that particular form of what it would describe as diplomacy, what I describe as conflict by other means. And I think there is definitely a desire in Western capitals to get rid of Putin, to have someone who's more Western friendly, for a whole lot of very obvious reasons, the most important economic, because the US is in a very, very difficult economic situation at the moment. Just this morning, I was reading something about it might default on some of its debt repayments. And of course, the big problem the US has is that a huge amount of its sovereign debt is actually held by China. And that has all sorts of consequences for the US. So absolutely, this could be an opportunity for Biden to try and flex American muscle. Also, there's an election in the not too distant future in the United States of America. And you have these two very elderly, very uninspiring men who are hoping to face off against each other once again. And, my own feeling on that is, another Biden-Trump election would be just horrific evidence of how appalling political leadership in our current age is across the world.
Talking about the war and the West's criticism of Putin and people who criticize their stance, it wasn't that long ago that former British Prime Minister Tony Blair was cozying up to Putin, was it?
This is another sort of a repetition of history so often. I mean, you might recall the Donald Rumsfeld, the US defense secretary at the time of the invasion of Iraq, was shown on television with old footage of him having a very pleasant meeting with Saddam Hussein, where he was basically doing business with him. And America did do business with Saddam Hussein. So the hypocrisy knows no bounds. And it's exactly the same with Putin. And, besides sort of Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, the other person who's always at the forefront of this hypocrisy is Tony Blair, who has personally made tens of millions of pounds out of the decision to invade Iraq, out of his promoting British arms companies, particularly BAE Systems, in a series of corrupt deals across the world, including our own arms deal. It's worth reminding ourselves that BAE wasn't even shortlisted for the huge multi-billion-pound contract that they won on our arms deal. And Blair made at least 2 or 3 visits to South Africa specifically to promote that deal. And BAE Systems paid £115 million of bribes to win that contract that they weren't shortlisted for. And at the time, they were doing about 6 or 7 other similar deals around the world with a total amount of bribery of over £1 billion. So, when people talk about our corruption in South Africa, which is a huge problem, and which I, was at the forefront of fighting for many years from within Parliament, we shouldn't forget where the bribes and the corruption come from. And if anyone is responsible, Tony Blair would be it. So, of course, Tony Blair has had very, very close and good relationships with Vladimir Putin that have probably made him money at some point over the years. And he had to very suddenly change his tune, as he always does, when Ukraine was invaded. And then he was all over the media talking about what an evil, awful man Vladimir Putin is. But the ultimate act of hypocrisy for me that a South African audience would relate to is that at the time that he was doing this corrupt deal on behalf of BAE Systems with our government, he also had something called the Commission on Africa going. And the Commission on Africa came to the astounding conclusion that Africa needs to be better governed and there needs to be less corruption amongst African leadership. And this was at the time that Blair was traveling the world paying over £1 billion of bribes on behalf of just one British defense company. So that hypocrisy is no surprise.
Sorry to interrupt you. Talking about our own arms deal, when can we expect you back in South Africa to come and help the NPA do its work?
So for many years now, I've been sort of on standby to give evidence in the trial of Jacob Zuma and Thales, the French company that allegedly bribed him. And, even during lockdown, I was being told to be ready to be in South Africa on this date or that date. And I'd go through all of the extraordinary procedures and all of the tests, et cetera, only to be told a day or two before I was due to leave that it had been postponed yet again. And I find it extraordinary that our judicial system allows a defendant to draw out a matter for what is, I don't even know how many years it's been now, but I mean, it's probably been well over 10 or even 12 or 15 years that this prosecution should have taken place. And initially, while Zuma was in power, it was obviously the NPA itself. The phrase "shorn the sheep" springs to mind, who ensured that Zuma wasn't charged, even though he had been charged previously. And then, once he was out of power, of course, we all thought the process would speed up, and to some extent it did. But then he's brought private prosecutions against the prosecutor, who he claims is discriminating against him, which I always thought was a prosecutor's job to do. And I am just amazed that our legal system allows for something like this to be strung out for this length of time. And I really think that given our own battles with corruption in the country at all levels, not just of the state, but of the private sector as well, and the collusion between the two, as we so obviously saw with state capture, the time has now come to start seeing some results. The time has now come to figure out what has happened. Why have the Guptas not been extradited to South Africa? Who made the mistakes that allowed that extradition request to not be honored by the UAE authorities? And how has the Jacob Zuma trial actually not come to trial, where evidence is led against both him and the French arms company, against whom there is overwhelming evidence of corruption? So it really does astonish me. And I find it very frustrating, but I keep on saying, I hope to be back very soon to give evidence against both Jacob Zuma and the French arms company Thales.
Well, hopefully we'll see you when you get here. That was global arms deal expert Andrew Feinstein speaking to us from London.
Very
Thank
much.
you, Andrew.